and thanks for joining us on Chicago Tonight. I'm Brandis Friedman. Here's what we're looking at.
What we're seeing in LA is chaos caused by the administration.
Legal questions emerge as President Trump deploys the National Guard to stem protests over immigration enforcement in California. And local business owners are raising concerns about the impact of the Trump administration's tariffs on steel and aluminum. And now to some of today's top stories. As the president's latest travel ban takes effect today, local immigrant and labor advocates joined forces in protest of the Trump administration's anti-immigration tactics in Los Angeles over the weekend.
All of this is being done under the false guises that there is a national emergency. There never was, and if anyone is responsible for any of the provocateurs and their violent actions, it is the Trump administration, Stephen Miller and Tom Homan, who seek to portray an emergency that does not exist.
The Illinois Coalition for Immigrant and Refugee Rights, along with members of the Service Employees International Union, protested federal agents arresting SEIU's California president David Huerta during a demonstration there last week. Huerta was reportedly released from custody today and faces a federal charge of conspiring to impede an officer. The groups are also protesting the administration's travel ban, which excludes travelers from 12 mainly African and Middle Eastern nations as Trump steps up efforts to enforce immigration. And we'll have more on the clash between protesters and federal agents in LA in just a few. Michael Madigan was back in the courtroom this afternoon, days ahead of the ex-House Speaker's sentencing for federal corruption. A federal judge today dismissed his attorney's motion for acquittal or a new trial. Prosecutors are seeking a 12-and-a-half-year prison term. Defense attorneys call that draconian and are seeking probation for the 83-year-old convicted on 10 counts of bribery, conspiracy, and wire fraud. Attorneys are expected back tomorrow to argue a defense motion to strike mentions of Madigan's net worth from public filings. Sentencing is set for Friday. Chicago is cracking down on illegal trash pickups. It's the latest development in a story we've been reporting on for nearly 2 years. Trash and recycling companies aren't allowed to make pickups in Chicago between 10 p.m. and 7 a.m., but many companies have been flouting the law and doing pickups earlier in the morning. Since our reporting, the city created a new 311 complaint category last October, and private waste haulers have been slapped with nearly 200 tickets for the early morning pickups during the first 6 months of the new enforcement. The companies hit with the most tickets are Lakeshore Waste, followed by Flood Brothers, Republic Services, and Waste Management. For more on this story and responses from some of the companies, check out our website. A Broadway production that first played on Chicago's Steppenwolf stage took home 2 Tony Awards last night, including Best Play.
My fellow artistic director, Audrey Francis, executive director Brooke Flanagan, and I dedicate this award to Steppenwolf's leadership staff, our board, and especially our ensemble. They are, without question, some of the great artists in our country. Risk takers and innovators have launched some of the boldest new plays in American theatrical canon.
That was actor and Steppenwolf artistic director Glenn Davis accepting the award for the play Purpose, which also won a Pulitzer this year. The theater commissioned playwright Brandon Jacobs Jenkins to create the production with theater ensemble actors and director Felicia Rashad, yes, of Cosby Show fame. It first opened in Chicago in 2024 before moving to Broadway, where it's now running through the end of August. To hear from the playwright and actors about their process, check out our website. Up next, a look at President Trump's decision to deploy the National Guard to stop protests over immigration enforcement in California. And later in the program, how local businesses are being impacted by the Trump administration's tariffs on steel and aluminum.
Chicago Tonight is made possible in part by the Alexandra and John Nichols family, the Jim and Kay Mabey family, the Polk Brothers Foundation, and the support of these donors.
An already tense standoff in California is getting tenser. The Pentagon says about 700 Marines are being activated to help protect federal property and personnel in the Los Angeles area amid ongoing protests over immigration enforcement. It comes after President Donald Trump already deployed around 300 National Guard troops despite objections from California Governor Gavin Newsom. But Newsom and others are pushing back, calling the move unlawful. Joining us now with more are Kevin Boyle, a professor of American history at Northwestern University. And over Zoom, we have David Franklin, a professor of law at DePaul University. Thanks to you both for joining us. Kevin, I want to first get your reaction to this latest news about the Marines also being deployed to LA.
Yeah, this is really an extraordinary, and in my mind, a really dangerous step for the President of the United States to use federal troops on American soil in this circumstance is really quite extraordinary.
Do these LA protests, do they look anything like what we've seen before when either National Guard or U.S. military troops were deployed?
No. The scale of these protests, at least from what I can tell from watching on TV, is much, much smaller than points in the past where either the National Guard were deployed or federal troops were deployed. This is a whole different scale.
David Franklin, similar question to you. What was your reaction when you saw that the president or that the government was deploying Marines to LA?
I had the same reaction as Professor Boyle. I mean, this is a really alarming and dangerous step by the Trump administration, even for an administration that has crossed many seemingly uncrossable lines in terms of taking our country in the direction of, frankly, authoritarianism, undermining the rule of law. This is a really serious Rubicon to cross because we have a constitutional history and tradition in this country of civilian control of the military rather than military control of civilians. So as Professor Boyle was saying, the use of federal or federalized troops to perform law enforcement function on civilian American streets is extremely rare. It's ordinarily been done in the past either with the consent or invitation of the governor of the state where it's happening, or it's happened because the government of the state was creating the problem, as in the civil rights era in the South. Neither of those things is true, and as Professor Boyle mentioned, the scope and scale of these demonstrations don't seem to rise anywhere near the level of what President Trump is now, with a kind of cruel irony, calling an insurrection. So I think it's a very troubling development.
Yeah, because this move by the Trump administration, it's unprecedented but not necessarily illegal. California is expected to sue. What could their argument be?
Well, I think the deployment of National Guard troops, if it is done solely to support the ICE officers that are already there, that is to say, if the National Guard is solely being brought in to provide protection for federal officials or federal law enforcement, but are not themselves interacting with civilians directly, that's probably legal. But calling up the Marines really risks violating not just that constitutional tradition that I referenced a minute ago, but also violating a federal statute, a very old federal statute called the Posse Comitatus Act. And so, there's an exception to that act. I don't want to get too technical here, but there's an exception in the form of another federal law called the Insurrection Act. But that law really can only be triggered if there is an insurrection. And I just don't think the factual predicate for that is present here. Would a court second guess the president's judgment that there is some sort of insurrection going on? That's a lot harder to say.
Kevin, David mentioned, the civil rights movement, other instances where this has happened. What was the case in those instances?
For the use of federalizing National Guardsmen, President Eisenhower did it in 1957, John Kennedy did it in 1962, and Lyndon Johnson did it in 1963. But in all three of those circumstances, the president was reacting either to the state itself violating the law, Little Rock, where the state was defying a federal court order for the integration of Little Rock Central High School, or the state was refusing to provide the sort of protection that protesters needed to protest peacefully in the United States. This is
to cross the Edmund Pettus Bridge in Selma, Alabama.
Well, and to march from Selma over to Montgomery, which is where they were trying to get to when they were crossing the Edmund Pettus Bridge. And this is a fundamentally different circumstance. This is using those troops potentially, or those federalized National Guardsmen, against protesters, not in protection of protesters, which is the circumstance in the 60s.
Okay, and then there was, were they called in also in 1990, what was it, 2 during the Rodney King riots?
Sure.
That was
there have been a number of times when federal troops were called in urban uprisings, but they were called in at the request of the governor, not in defiance of the governor, who in this circumstance has explicitly said he doesn't want this mobilization. So there were troops called out in 1967 in the Detroit uprising, 1992 in LA. But in both those circumstances, in 68 in Chicago, actually after Martin Luther King's murder, but in all those circumstances, local officials asked for troops to be deployed. It wasn't in defiance of the local officials.
And in this case, Governor Gavin Newsom has said the opposite, insisting that LAPD has the situation under control. David, couldn't the Trump administration argue that the state is defying federal immigration policy and therefore it was necessary to send in federalized troops?
I could argue that, but from everything that I can see, that just doesn't appear to be the case. There are protesters on the street. If those protesters are acting violently or unlawfully, they can be dealt with. But there's no evidence that I've seen that the state itself is defying or violating federal law enforcement. So, you know, as I say, the predicate for escalating this to the point of involving federal troops on American streets and American cities just has not been laid. And it's an incredibly dangerous situation.
Well, I mean, and an incredibly dangerous situation because this set a precedent that the National Guard could be sent to other cities if the president doesn't like the protests he sees there, like Chicago.
Yeah, and in fact, Trump issued a memorandum in relation to the situation in Los Angeles. But if you read the memorandum, it never mentions Los Angeles or California. So he's clearly trying to lay the groundwork for nationwide use of National Guard or perhaps, as we've seen, federal troops like the Marines. You know, and perhaps he's trying to, distract and deflect from his own falling poll numbers or the difficulty in passing his signature piece of legislation or his fight with Elon Musk. Who knows what his reasons are? But it's a very dangerous line to cross. Look, I mean, federal troops are not trained to do law enforcement on the street. They don't have the relevant training, and it creates a completely new and dangerous dynamic between the civilian population and the military.
Yeah, David, that's where we'll have to leave it. Obviously, something that we'll be keeping close eyes on in the next few days to see how this plays out. David Franklin, Kevin Boyle, thanks to you both for joining us.
Thanks so much for having us.
Appreciate it. And we're back with more right after this. We'll get back to our program in just 2 minutes for our conversation about the surprising local impact of President Trump's steel and aluminum tariffs. But I wanted to take a moment to talk with you about something I believe is very important, and that's the journalism we bring to you each and every night. PBS and WTTW have always had a partnership with our local audience, and that support is more critical now than it's ever been. As a WTTW and Chicago Tonight viewer, you understand the value of trusted local public media programming, including the journalism you get from Chicago Tonight, as well as the PBS NewsHour. You've likely heard that there is a serious threat looming. If approved by Congress, the proposed federal budget cut called a rescission would threaten the ability of stations like WTTW to serve our audience with fair, fact-based, unbiased, nonpartisan news reporting. Here's what some of you, our viewers, have written in to tell us. This is my primary source of unbiased news. It's also a primary location for my grandchildren's positive viewing. WTTW and PBS are my choice for fact-based, unbiased news, along with a great amount of entertaining and educational programming. It's information I know I can trust. PBS is very important for me for showing the real facts and news around the world without false narratives. Many of you have asked what you can do to help ensure that WTTW remains strong. If this is something that's important to you, you can make your voice heard by contacting your member of Congress. You can learn the facts at WTTW.com/protectmypublicmedia and share those facts with your family and friends. And if it's right for you, you can donate to WTTW by calling 773-588-1111 or going to WTTW.com or scanning the QR code right there on your screen. We hope you find value in what we do here at WTTW News, Chicago Tonight, and throughout the day and night on WTTW. So please consider supporting us in whatever way feels right to you, because we are in this together. Thank you. Chicago Tonight returns in a moment. Businesses and manufacturing are starting to feel the impact of steel and aluminum tariffs that took effect last week. The Trump administration is putting a 50% tax on these metals when they're imported from other countries. Backers say it's an effort to protect national security and promote more domestic manufacturing. But critics say it could drive up costs. Here with more on the local impact are Julie Workman, a real estate lawyer and partner at Saul Ewing, LLP, Ray Stout, executive director of the Illinois Craft Brewers Guild, and Robert Gulati, a political science professor at the University of Chicago. Thanks to you all for joining us. Ray Stout, let's start with you first. Please describe how important steel and aluminum are in producing and distributing beer.
So steel and aluminum are used in every input, right? So from cans to vessels to brewing equipment, everything that's in a brew house or everything you drink out of in the craft beer industry and here in Illinois and across the country is made in steel and served in aluminum.
Okay, so pretty important, obviously. Julie Workman, how important are steel and aluminum, of course, in home building?
Steel and aluminum are critical. You need steel beams to provide support to buildings. You need aluminum for ductwork. And going beyond that, precious metals are used in things that you wouldn't necessarily think about. Doorknobs, drawer pulls, light fixtures, plumbing fixtures. They are omnipresent throughout new homes.
Yeah, it sounds like the backbone. It's the whole thing,
Absolutely.
right? The work
Absolutely.
that both of you do. Robert, the Trump administration imposing tariffs on steel and aluminum during his first term as well. What was the impact then?
Well, one thing to be aware of in the first administration is they pulled out the tariffs only a few months after putting them in on Canada and Mexico, which is part of the U.S. NAFTA renegotiations. But during the history of the United States and recent history, we've seen a number of times where these tariffs have been put in effect. Under the Bush administration, for example, there were similar tariffs in 2002. What we saw was a reduction in jobs in the steel consuming industries by about 200,000 workers. That was more workers than in the entire steel industry combined. So the general effect has been very negative when these things have been tried, and as a result, they haven't been tried for very long.
If you would, give me sort of like a brief sort of like walkthrough of how higher tariff means fewer jobs here, because the Trump administration, their whole point is that their expectation is that this will increase jobs in manufacturing here at home.
So a tariff puts a tax on the importation of steel, in this case, or aluminum. About 25% of U.S. steel is imported from other countries, and that means when you're trying to put something together like a car, that's going to increase the costs associated with it. If you can't push those costs onto consumers, the only other option is to shut down and furlough workers. The consequences can be dramatic, especially in communities that rely on the consumption of steel for their products, which are many small towns across the United States. And one of the challenges here is that those job losses don't come back immediately. You lose access to a small business in a community, that might destroy the community itself. And that's what we saw in the Bush administration and in the first Trump administration.
Julie, how does this uncertainty, how does this impact construction and development?
It makes it very hard to get deals done. In our world, developers will do a financial analysis before they will even start working on a project. They'll look at how much it's going to cost, what their profit margin will be at the end of the day, and if you don't know what pricing looks like from one day to the next, it makes it almost impossible to run those pro formas and figure out what your deal is going to, whether you're going to have a profit at the end of the day.
And Ray, what could this mean for beer prices?
So across the brewing industry right here in Illinois, we manufacture and use over a billion cans every year, right? So even a slight price increase would be drastically detrimental to our industry. And you're exactly right. Those, either the organization could weather those costs, or they could pass it on to the consumer. And what we're seeing is that organizations that weather those costs do in fact end up having to make staffing decisions to backfill those losses.
What are you feeling right now? What are you noticing?
We're seeing keg companies actually starting to close in the United States of America. We've started receiving first notice of that. We're starting to see aluminum manufacturers and can manufacturers starting to raise costs. But what we're seeing that affects the smallest breweries more than the larger ones, right? So if you're buying anywhere between 10 cents to 25 cents per can, multiply that by a billion, right? And so due to the economies of scale, those large manufacturers obviously get the best price breaks. So it's going to hurt the smallest businesses first.
Small margins in
That's
your
exactly
industry.
right.
Julie, what about you? What are you all noticing?
At this point, the effects have been limited, but we're anticipating that costs of homes are going to start going up a lot. The National Association of Home Builders has polled its members, and members are anticipating home price increases of up to $11,000 per home, $10,900. Right now, the increases have been fairly small, but with the tariffs being implemented now, those prices are going to start going up in probably Q3 of this year.
Robert, Trump administration, like I said, they're arguing that this is going to promote domestic manufacturing. Is that likely, and when could that happen? Or are we going to see the same thing that has happened in previous administrations?
There will be an increase in the production of some products that are made from steel and aluminum from smelters that already exist in the United States that are operating at half or below half capacity. But that's only going to mean a marginal increase in the domestic supply relative to the consequences for downstream industry. So there will be some people that will be able to sell more steel and aluminum at higher prices, but there's a lot more people that consume that steel than there are that produce it. And when I say a lot more, I mean a lot more. As we see industries across transportation, as we saw packaging, or the canning industry, it's across the board that's going to be affecting people. And we'll begin to see those effects pretty soon as we dwindle down the warehouses that are currently storing, as you showed at the opening shot, wheels of aluminum.
Ray, is there much that small craft breweries can do to adapt?
There's not a lot. It's going to hurt the smallest businesses in this state and in this country. Our brewers are looking at other options for glass bottling, for example. But these small breweries have set up canning lines and made huge investments on that infrastructure, and they're not able to go out and kind of rejigger their brewing operations.
Can't just switch it up.
Can't just fix it.
Yeah. Julie, the city, as you know, we're already facing challenges with housing shortages, especially with regards to affordable housing. You mentioned, likely home price increases in the future. What's the impact you think this could have on housing in the city?
It's going to have a huge impact. We all know that there is a major affordable housing shortage in this country, here in particular in Illinois, and you have builders who are willing to build homes, and they want to build homes, whether it's apartments, condos, townhomes, single-family homes. But pricing is going to be a major headwind, and it's going to impact their willingness to put shovels in the ground at the end of the day, and it's going to stop projects, unfortunately.
Robert, what do you say to the idea that the U.S. shouldn't be so reliant on other countries for steel and aluminum?
That's fair. I mean, it is true that we're basically down to a few smelters for aluminum, and the steel industry has suffered over the course of the past few decades, and you could think that a small share of that will be important for national security purposes. But the defense industry consumes about 3% of U.S. aluminum. It's only about 5% of U.S. steel, it's not obvious that this is the way that you would want to achieve that end. If we cared about having a regular supply of aluminum, just buy aluminum using the defense contracts. There's other ways to achieve this, and we've seen other administrations take those tactics in the past. For example, there's a new aluminum plant, the first in 40 years, that was going to be opened up under the Inflation Reduction Act, but that's just maybe going to be killed under this new funding measure.
All right. So a tough time right now that goes into effect soon, right? It's this new tariff goes into effect like
It's
tomorrow.
already
in effect. Okay. That's what we'll have to leave it. Best of luck to Ray Stout, Julie Workman, Robert Galati. Thanks to all three of you for joining us.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
And that's our show for this Monday night. Join us tomorrow night at 5:30 and 10. Cook County erases more than $600 million in medical debt for 500,000 residents. A look at the impact it's having. Now, for all of us here at Chicago Tonight, I'm Brandis Friedman. Thank you for watching. Stay healthy and safe, and have a good night.
Closed captioning is made possible by Robert A. Clifford and Clifford Law Offices, a Chicago personal injury and wrongful death firm that supports educational initiatives in the legal profession.